Greetings. I'm Father Bob Yezel, and I'm retired from Holy Cross Church in DeWitt and also from the Diocese of Syracuse. I'm very excited to welcome you to our new website, especially in light of COVID. So many of us have been hit by that terrible, terrible pandemic. I spent 7 months in hospitals and rehabs. Perhaps you or your loved one has as well. And so today we're finding a new way to come to you, and that's by the website. I pray that this brings you great peace, consolation, and new spiritual insights. During the past year and a half, Father Cliff Auth and Katie Tovar have certainly been running a wonderful program. Father Cliff is from St. Augustine's in Baldwinsville and St. Mary's in Baldwinsville. Katie Tovar, you know, is a standard person at the CARE program. She keeps us together. She's the backbone of the organization. I'm so grateful to both of those wonderful people for keeping the program going and helping us to come to you now via the website. I pray that as we have new speakers and we have some new topics, we can have some new insights. And I'm sure that's going to happen as we come out of the cocoons we've all been in and move on in life. And so we're excited about having you get excited with us and be a part of our community as well. So thank you for being with us today. And thank you for all that you do, and thank you for your prayers. God bless you, and you have a great day.
Good morning. Oh, wait a minute. Maybe I shouldn't say good morning, because I don't know what time of day you'll be watching this. My name is Maryanne Corasaniti, and I'm a member of CARE, and here today to talk to you about social isolation and loneliness. We have some terrific staff videotaping us today, Will and Sebastian, and they've made it possible for you to also follow along with me with a PowerPoint presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about today will be the religious foundations for caring for others. What is loneliness? What's social isolation? What are the medical and psychological outcomes for people who are socially isolated? And what are some possible solutions to social isolation? Interestingly enough, almost every faith has some tenet about how we look out for and care for others. For example, in Genesis 18, the Torah tells people to adopt a sacred purpose, spreading righteousness and justice in the world. And it also says that according to God's covenant with Abraham, every Jew is called upon not simply to believe in the value of righteousness and justice, but to act on them, motivated by moral responsibility to advocate as Abraham did on behalf of vulnerable nations. And in Islam that we hear so much about, you are to do good to parents, kinfolk, orphans, the poor, your neighbor who is your kin, the neighbor who is stranger, the companion by your side, the wayfarer, and those slaves whom your hand possesses. And for those of us who are Christians, we know that Christ called for this as well. In John 13:34, I give you a new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. So you also should love one another. And in Matthew 22:39, a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. And I would point out to you that we often think about loving our neighbor and not ourselves. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about why it's important that we are also caring for ourselves in that process. In the 1 John chapter 3, verse 18, my children, our love should not be just words and talk. It must be true love, which shows itself in action. And lastly, what's important, no matter what your faith is that recent research, and actually research over the past 50 years, has shown us that when we are kind, there are strong outcomes for that, as found in a lot of research done over, as I said, over the last 50 years, but also Darwin himself felt that without caring for each other, a species would not necessarily survive. So if we are kind to each other, it makes us happier. When I'm kind to someone else, I become happier. It's also physically good for your heart. And what's important to some of us who are watching today is it slows aging. Caring for other people slows aging. It also improves our relationships, and it's contagious. What do I mean by that? Well, it spreads. When you're kind to someone, they're often kind to one another. What's important to know about this is there are actual physical effects of being kind. The vagus nerve runs from our brain to most of our organs, but particularly to our heart and our gut. And it communicates with all those organs. And when we're kind, it releases within our brains oxytocin and serotonin, which are the things that make us feel love, trust, warm and fuzzy. So how does this happen physically? Well, have you ever heard of micro moments? What does your face or heart do when you look at an infant? What did your face or heart do when you see a cat and dog kind of cuddling up to each other? Those are micro moments. Those are the times when we have warm feelings. And again, when we are kind to others, we have warm feelings. What I'd like to really talk about today is social isolation and loneliness, particularly in the time of COVID. What's important to know is that social isolation can affect anyone, young or old. And what's equally important to know is that if you are socially isolated, no matter your age, you have the same physical and psychological effects. You are more apt to be ill from it than someone who is not socially isolated. So we are by nature social beings. Aristotle himself, the great philosopher, said, man is by nature a social animal. And the Dalai Lama is quoted as saying, we human beings are social beings. We come into the world as the result of others' actions. We survive here in dependence on others. In other words, when I'm an infant, I can't survive if there isn't someone else caring for me. Whether we like it or not, there is hardly a moment of our lives when we do not benefit from others' activities. Perfect example of this is I'm sitting here and we're preparing this video for you to watch. So I'm working on it, but there are other people with me. As I mentioned earlier, Will and Sebastian are working hard to make sure that this presentation is there for you, as was Kate, who set this up from CARE. There are always people doing things in our lives that are social in nature. And as the Dalai Lama said, for this reason, it is hardly surprising that most of our happiness arises in the context of our relationship with others. Interestingly enough, Harvard University has been doing a longitudinal study, which means over a period of time, for over 80 years. Dr. Robert Waldinger and others started this in 1938. And they thought that what they would find was the happiest people who graduated from Harvard down the road would be happy because they made a lot of money, or they had prestigious jobs, they were politicians, they were experts in their fields. What they found continually over these 80 years is the people that are the most happy are the people that have the best relationships. They're the people who are caring for someone else or others. And they found that people who were happy in their 50s were the healthiest in their 80s. Again, there are physical effects of being connected to other people. If you were here, I'd be asking you what you thought loneliness was. What researchers say is it's the subjective feeling of social disconnection. Social isolation, on the other hand, is more objective. It includes living alone, having very few social ties, not having people to confide in, and not spending time with others very often. Waldinger, the researcher at Harvard I told you about, says, loneliness kills. It is as powerful as smoking or alcoholism. So how would we define social isolation? It's a state in which the individual lacks a sense of belonging socially, lacks engagement with others, has a minimal number of social contacts, and they are deficient in fulfilling and quality relationships. So even if I'm getting Meals on Wheels and I see the Meals on Wheels person drop it off for my lunch and dinner, and all we say is hi, or the meal is left on my steps, there's not a real meaningful social contact there. Or if I'm going through the line in Wegmans or Tops, just because I say hello and the clerk says, how are you, that's not a meaningful relationship. If I go home to an empty house and I have no one that I'm in contact with regularly whom I care about or who cares about me, that's social isolation. So it's the involuntary or voluntary absence of contacts with other peoples. Before I move on to how widespread it is, you should know that there's no one definition for social isolation. Everybody kind of has similar objectives of who's alone and who isn't alone, and who's isolated and who isn't. But I think it's something that we kind of recognize and know when we see it. And that's what's important. Do I see others who are socially isolated? So how widespread is the problem of social isolation? An estimate of 1 in 5 adults over the age of 50, which is at least 8 million, are affected by social isolation. 28% of people over 65 live alone. That's 14.7 million people. When you look at that number, though, you should always recognize there are some people who choose and want to live alone. Those aren't the people I'm talking about. But in that number are 5 million men and 9.7 million women. 50% of older women age 75 plus live alone. 43% of adults over 60 felt lonely during the pandemic. That's a sizable number of people over the age of 60. The University of Michigan poll found 56 of adults 50 to 80 years of age reported feelings of isolation during the COVID pandemic. And why wouldn't they? We locked ourselves up in our homes and were told not to go out. So if someone wasn't reaching out to them, they would be feeling socially isolated. So now we know that there's a sizable number of people who are socially isolated. What are the medical and psychological outcomes for people who are socially isolated? Well, first of all, it increases the risk of heart disease by 29% and stroke by 32%. It increases your systolic blood pressure. That's important because that's where our heart attacks and strokes come from. It weakens your immune system. So we're telling everybody, get a vaccination. At the same time, when they're socially isolated, we recognize their immune systems may not be able to fully take effect, the vaccine when we give it to them, or the flu shot, because they're socially isolated. Their bodies aren't functioning as well as they could. People who are socially isolated are twice as likely to die prematurely. It increases hospitalization and rehospitalization. And why wouldn't it? So if I'm alone and I become hospitalized, when I go to the hospital, I may have the first social contacts I've had in a long time. And I may be willing to go back again just to have that connection. In addition to the other things, social isolation results in loneliness and depression. What's important about that is men over the age of 70, are at the greatest risk of suicide. And social isolation can lead to that. It increases everyone who's socially isolated. It increases their risk of death in the next 7 years. Of those older adults studied, 45% had a high probability of cognitive decline. Interestingly enough, many years ago, I was the executive director of the Alzheimer's Association. And we were lucky enough at that time to have an adult day program next to our office. One of the reasons you had an adult day program was for the socialization of people who have cognitive decline. that socialization piece helps to keep the brain functioning. So if I socially isolate you, then there isn't the opportunity for that socialization. And people who are socially isolated are more likely to need long-term care. And part of that relates to the fact that who's going to take care of them when all of these conditions may occur. So how do people become socially isolated? Well, we know how they became socially isolated over the last year and a half, and that was through the government and others socially isolating us to keep us well and safe because of COVID. But what are the other things that lead to it? Living alone. Boy, that seems kind of obvious, doesn't it? But if I'm living alone, not because I choose to, but because I'm forced to because of changes in my life, that affects my isolation process. So if I have mobility or sensory impairments, if I can't hear well, or I can't speak well, that may make me feel as if I don't want to be out in public. Or if I have difficulty ambulating, that too can make me feel as if others will be looking at me as if I don't want to be out in public, or I shouldn't be out in public. Another thing that contributes to social isolation is major life transitions or losses. So what do I mean by that? Well, if someone you love or have been close to passes away and you're no longer able to interact with them socially, whether that's a spouse or a friend, that changes things as well. The other thing is oftentimes when we get older, we've spent our whole lives saving to get a big house somewhere for all our children, and now they've all moved away, and they're telling me, Mom, you don't need this big house anymore. Let's have you move into a smaller space. So I move, but I don't know anyone. And I don't feel comfortable in my new space. So rather than go out and socialize, I begin to withdraw and become more socially isolated. Low income or limited financial resources can also contribute to social isolation. What do I mean by that? Well, it's difficult if my granddaughter or grandson is having a birthday and I don't have the resources to buy them a gift. I may just say I'm going to stay home today. And the more I stay home, the easier it gets to stay home. And the less expected I am to show up for those things. Another serious thing that leads to social isolation is caring for someone with a serious long-term condition, such as Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease. People should not be afraid to go out in public, but they are often, and so they will isolate or will not invite friends to come in. Lastly, the pandemic itself led to social isolation. Probably rightfully so, but what were we doing during that time to ensure that people weren't socially isolated? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. What you could do, or any of us can do, to stay engaged and involved, but also to ensure that you're keeping track of people who might be socially isolated. So again, what additional things lead to social isolation? Psychological or cognitive challenges also do. So most people are uncomfortable with people with mental health, or I shouldn't say most, many people are uncomfortable with people who have mental health issues. And so they don't invite them to participate in things. Or if I'm uncomfortable in a crowd, I may not do that as well. So all of those things contribute to me isolating. Inadequate social supports, and we should all be looking at this as a society. How do we ensure that people who are socially isolated, be they young or old, but I'm focusing more on older people today, that they don't lack social supports? And how do we frame that? Can our churches help frame that? Can our Office for Aging help frame that? Can Adult Protective Services? Can my neighborhood help frame that? How do we do that? Other social isolation can result as rural or unsafe or inaccessible neighborhoods. In other words, If I don't feel safe to go out, I'm not going out. If I live rurally, we often had this issue when I was at the Alzheimer's Association. The husband may have been the only one in the family that drove, and as he progressed in his disease in rural areas, there was no way for the people to get from where they lived in a rural area into the city to get groceries, etc. So if that's the case, how do we support that and make sure that people do have adequate transportation, which is also an important issue for older people? Language barriers. I'm doing this presentation from Syracuse, New York, and on the news this morning or yesterday, I heard that we're anticipating 200 people from Afghanistan to arrive soon into our community to help them become part of central New York. And all of them may have, or many of them may have, language barriers. How will we help them? If I feel isolated by my language, I may not feel comfortable going out. Another very important part of this is aging, racial differences, ethnic differences, sexual orientation, or gender identity barriers. Oftentimes, people who are from the non-dominant race feel uncomfortable going out in public. They don't feel safe. People with different sexual orientations or gender identity barriers don't feel welcome in certain places. All of that leads to social isolation. And for many of them, reaching out for support is difficult because they have experienced prejudice in the past. So let me spend a minute or so talking to you about social isolation and elder abuse. Both living with someone else and being socially isolated have been associated with higher elder abuse rates. That's contradictory, isn't it? What we know is that if you are socially isolated, it's easier to abuse you because no one will see you. So if I punch someone in the eye today and I keep them from being seen by anyone for 2 or 3 weeks, that bruising will be gone. If the abuser's living with me, I'm sure to be socially isolated because they don't want me telling you what they're doing to me. It's difficult for me to give you specifics about COVID and how it affected elder abuse because those numbers were nowhere to be found as I was preparing this presentation. But I can tell you that in every country that I looked at, China, Argentina, Cyprus, Singapore, Brazil, some of those are cities, by the way, and in our own San Antonio, Texas, Portland, Oregon, and New York City, in every single place, there was an increase in domestic violence. That we know. Well, elder abuse is part of that domestic violence. The numbers I don't have, but I can guarantee you that there was an increase in the rate of abuse, particularly among people who are marginalized. And by that I mean people of different races, ethnicities, again, sexual orientation, and citizenship status. This was a difficult time for everyone, the COVID period. It's not over yet. We're still struggling with it. We're still frightful if we're older about, do I need a booster shot? Don't I need a booster shot? How safe am I? Where am I safe? Should I be masked? Shouldn't I be masked? All of that anxiety helps to increase the likelihood that people will socially isolate. In addition, people who are marginalized will be less apt to seek vaccination, support, etc. So elder abuse plays a part in this social isolation, and a big one. Social connections promote healthy aging and protect against mental health problems. Promoting social connectedness has the potential to improve health and well-being as we age and protects against age-related stressors. If I'm socially connected, I'm less depressed. I have less hopelessness. I have a sense of better well-being. Again, I'm going to re-emphasize that less depression because that's very, very important. Because suicide in older men particularly is very dominant. It's the highest incidence of suicide among all the population of the United States is men over the age of 70. So we want to make sure that they're not socially isolated. It also, social connectedness and helps my cognition. When I'm socializing, I'm doing something that keeps my brain active, and it lowers my risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease. So what can you do to prevent your own isolation? Stay mobile, exercise, take a class. So what do I mean by that? Well, locally here in Syracuse, there's an organization called Oasis, and Oasis provides actually college-level classes, or at least taught by college professors, for people over the age of 60. They may have changed it to 50, but it's also being done remotely from all over the country. I've just taken a couple good classes from a professor out in San Diego, all because of Zoom and other platforms that allow us to go across the divide of social isolation and connect us to other people. Is Zoom the answer? No, but it is a temporary solution. Visit a senior center. Well, some of them are open and some are not. But if you can, try that. Make sure you're eating well. And if at all possible, volunteer. Skype or Zoom with your family and friends. Set a time every day or every week that you connect with somebody and make sure you make it happen. It's also important, if you're feeling lonely, to let others know that and to maintain a healthy routine. Here's what happens to people who are socially isolated. They go from the bedroom to the kitchen to the chair to the bedroom all day long. They're not doing anything to connect themselves to others. So if you're a person who's socially isolated right now, think about how you can change that routine. Could you take a class from Oasis? Could you take a class from CARE? Could you keep connected to other people? And how would you do that? But make sure you're breaking the pattern of allowing yourself to be isolated. So for people who are homebound right now, invite people over for coffee. Make sure they're vaccinated, but still invite them for coffee, and they can sit 6 feet away from you if they need to. Schedule a time each day, if possible, to connect by phone with someone. And if you can, allow others to visit you. I'm going to re-emphasize this. Let people know you're lonely. I think sometimes, particularly young people, think that if I tell somebody I'm lonely, they'll think there's something wrong with me. Well, why don't you have friends? You should have friends. Loneliness isn't just related to friendship. It's life circumstances. And there's nothing wrong with admitting that you feel lonely. The bigger question is, how can we as a community address social isolation? I think if you see someone you know is socially isolated, say something. Talk to them about their social isolation. Recognize it. Be able to say, I know the things that make you socially isolated. I can see that. Recognize that the person is isolated. And work together as a community. We should all be working together as a community to find solutions to social isolation. The Office for Aging, Adult Protective Services, AARP, medical and health providers, senior centers, the police, faith communities. Who else would you put on that list? Who else do you think could help to change social isolation? I put myself on that list. I say I have to be part of that solution for many reasons. For faith reasons, for health reasons, just being kind is enough to keep me healthy. If you can, identify and attend to older individuals who are living alone, who have no meaningful social contacts. If we were in this room together and we were all here, I would have started with a a presentation that got you to get up and talk to somebody you didn't know. Many people don't like that, and they kind of grumble when I suggest it. I don't want to do that. But they get up, and I tell them the first question they ask is, ask the other person how you got your name. Who named you, and why is that your name? That's an innocuous question. It doesn't bother anybody to answer that. Then I ask them, tell me the different places you've lived in your life. So this goes on for about 5 to 10 minutes when I start this presentation with people with me. And when the 10 minutes is up, all the people who were grumbling about, oh, I don't want to go over there and meet that other person, have all come back to their seats grumbling that I have stopped them from talking to their newfound friend. That's what helps to break social isolation. Don't be afraid to talk to someone and ask them questions that are simple, not intrusive, but just simple questions. What's your name? Who named you? Why did they name you that? If I were to ask my grandson that, his name is James, and James would say, my dad named me. And he named me after my grandfather, and after my great-grandfather. And my son named his son after my father. And it was very important to my son because he was always close to my father. That's a story that people can understand and gets you interested in that other person. You don't have to ask big questions like, what's your income? But just start a conversation with someone you think is socially isolated. Support programs like Senior Companions. They provide meaningful social contacts for people. And when you're engaged with someone in that conversation, ask them if they're lonely. And if they tell you they are, be prepared to help them. Be prepared to go and see them once in a while. The other piece I would give you if we were together is a scenario of, here's an elderly gentleman who's lived next door to your house forever. And within the last year, his wife has died. And although this person was meticulous about his yard, his lawn being cut, his trash out on time, all of a sudden, he doesn't look as nicely dressed. He's not doing the lawn. He isn't taking the trash out. What are you going to do? What do you suspect may be going on with your neighbor? He is your neighbor. And we are called to support our neighbors and care for them. So how could you help others? Check on your elderly neighbors and family members regularly. Ask them if they're lonely. Ask them what would make them less lonely, and try to help provide that. See your neighbor or family member regularly, even if it's only a brief visit. You know, I've had people say to me when I do this presentation, well, I'm really busy. You know, I have a full-time job and I have kids and yeah, we all do. Half an hour out of every week could you give to talk to that older person? 15 minutes. Set a regular time and contact them and talk to them, whether it's your neighbor or your family member. See your neighbor regularly, your neighbors, even if it's just a brief visit. I have a questionnaire that I'm going to give to Kate that you can take, and it actually checks to see if people are lonely. And I have a list of questions that you can ask. So I'm going to put this back on Kate, which isn't fair, but CARE will have these, and you can get them. We'll find a way to get them to you so that you know, how do I start that conversation with an older person? And I would argue that the questions don't just work for older people, they work for everybody. But you can also connect them to programming locally. The Interreligious Council has a program called One to One that unites older people with visitors who come to see them. I saw this program on something I was watching the other day, and it was called Big and Mini. And it was started by a college student who realized that older people, she was, I think, working part-time in a nursing home, and realized that older people connected well with younger people, and that there was a symmetry that they could have that helped both of them. So she started this program called Big and Mini, and it's all over the country. You can call her or call the program, and I don't have the number, I apologize for that, but just look up Big and Mini, and they connect younger people with older people so that they share their stories. And there are other programs like that as well. The Interreligious Council locally is supporting a program where a group of older people come together each week. It's Zoomed, which isn't always easy for people, but they can also have a phone conversation with someone else. Places are trying, I know our local power company, National Grid, linked a calling program where older people were called regularly by someone during the pandemic when things were shut down. So find out what's available. Call the Office for Aging. Ask them how you can help. How can you help? Again, support senior companions. You can go to the New York State Office for Aging Services, and there are suggestions there of what you can do. There's a program, Campaign to Combat Isolation and Loneliness. It's interesting, we're just getting attuned to this in our country. England literally has a minister in their government of social isolation. It's their responsibility to check on people who are socially isolated throughout the country. We're just getting to understand the psychological and physical results of social isolation. And I've outlined them for you today, but think about that. It's so serious, that health issue is so serious that England has this minister that takes care of the people throughout the country. Again, the senior companions and one-to-one are a great thing. Contact, if you're feeling seriously lonely and isolated, our local contact, and the number is on the slide, 315-251-0600. If you're contemplating hurting yourself or you know someone that is, call Contact. Oasis, again, a place where you can get classes for older people that will keep you connected. PACE is a health program locally in Central New York, and the Dunbar Center also provides senior programming. Before I close, I want to go back to read some scripture to you, Matthew 25. For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Naked and you clothed me. Ill and you cared for me. In prison and you visited me. Amen, I say to you, what you did not do for one of these least ones, you did not do for me. The reason I'm reading that to you is because I want to go back to the piece of scripture where we were told to take care of others as we take care of ourselves. If you're isolated and lonely, reach out and let people know that. It isn't just yourself you're supposed to take care of, nor is it just others we're supposed to take care of. It's important that we are taking care of each other. St. Teresa of Avila said, Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks compassion on this world. Yours are the feet with which he walks to do good. Yours are the hands through which he blesses all the world. Yours are the hands, yours are the feet, yours are the eyes, and yours are his body. Christ has no body now on earth but yours. Mother Teresa, I used to pray that God would feed the hungry or do this or that, but now I pray that he will guide me to do whatever I'm supposed to do, what I can do. I used to pray for answers, but now I'm praying for strength. I used to believe that prayer changes things, but now I know that prayer changes us and we change things. So what are we called to do? Can your faith community make a difference? Can you be the person that makes a difference? You can be. You just have to choose to recognize that it's our calling, each of us, and we're a better society. As Darwin said, the species that cares for each other will be the species that survives. So let's all recognize that we have a responsibility to take care of ourselves and others who are socially isolated. Thank you.
Hey there, my name is Chris Spilka and I'm the director here at Christ the King Retreat House in Syracuse. And I want to thank the CARE program for coming here. They're a tremendous organization. We are excited to host them. Since 1944, we have a tremendous legacy that actually began with the Jesuits over at Lemoyne College, if you can believe it. They began this beautiful tradition here at the Retreat House that carries on to today. In 1994, the Diocese of Syracuse purchased this place for $1 whole. It's the best bargain, I think, in the history of mankind. And since then, we have served as a refuge for many and assisted in their spiritual development. Maybe you are an individual that is really struggling despair and really feeling downtrodden these days. If you're feeling that way, this is a place that is perfect for you. We have many conference spaces and rooms that you can sit, relax, and refocus in a beautifully renovated chapel that you can come pray and talk to the Lord and let these different burdens off your heart. Maybe you're a group leader that is just looking to refocus and recalibrate the mission of your organization. If that is you, then we have 2 beautiful conference spaces in our Merton Room and Loyola Room that's perfect for the size of any group. If you are interested in coming here to Christ the King Retreat House, I invite you to check out our inquiry link on our website, ctkretreat.com. You can click on the inquiry there and you'll be connected with me, and we will book your retreat, whatever it may be. I look forward to speaking with you, and I hope that you'll join our beautiful tradition here and be a part of our history at Christ the King Retreat House. God bless you.